Happy Monday and welcome back to SPED Education. I'm your host, Brandon Reed, and if this is your first time to the channel, a special welcome to you. Well, it's a new week and we have a new lesson. What are we going to be learning about today? Today's lesson, how difficult is it to be a special education teacher? Being a teacher can be difficult within itself. There are a lot of responsibilities that teachers have, and they have to work with a lot of students. And a lot of people think that special education is, or maybe a little bit easier, because instead of working with 200 kids a day, like a general ed teacher, a special ed teacher only has to work with maybe 20 or 30 or maybe even 40. But special education can be extremely difficult. And if you're probably wondering, well, yeah, I'm sure it can. What are some of the challenges with it? Well, I'm glad that you asked. Some of the responsibilities of a special education teacher include assessing student skills and determining their educational needs. Sometimes this requires educators, special educators, to sometimes test individuals with learning disabilities. If you have a student in your class that may have a learning disability, but you're not quite sure yet, then what we would probably do is assess their abilities, maybe pull them out, give them some tests to kind of get an idea or gauge where their level is. Now, as for educational testing, that's not necessarily something that's all special ed teachers are licensed to do. In that case, we would have to refer them to an educational psychologist. But there are some things that we can do to assess what types of services or what types of supports that an individual with learning disabilities might need. Adapt general lessons to meet students' needs. This means that we would have to meet with general ed teachers, maybe even look over their lesson plans and give them ideas or suggestions on how best to accommodate students with learning disabilities. Develop individualized education programs, IEPs, for each student. So again, if you only work with 30 or 40 students compared to a general ed teacher where they work with maybe 200 students, you may be thinking, well, I mean, that's pretty easy, right? Not exactly, because those IEPs, those are legally binding contracts, and they have to be followed to a T. So whenever you write one, it has to be individualized for that student. So that means that you have to know each and every student's IEP so that when an issue comes up, you can refer back to it. Plan activities that are specific to each student's abilities. Sometimes this requires you to work with the general ed teacher to come up with ways, accommodations, or modifications to help students in the general ed class. Teach and mentor students as a class in small groups and one-on-one. In addition to all of the other responsibilities that I've just mentioned, sometimes special ed teachers have to teach a class. So that means that they have to come up with lesson plans. They have to grade the papers. They have to actually teach the class. And in addition to all those other responsibilities, it can be a little overwhelming. Implement IEPs, assess students' performance, and track their progress. One of the hardest things for special ed teachers is time, because trying to find time to do all of these different responsibilities, including progress monitoring students' goals. So if you have a student, sometimes their IEP, they may have more than one goal. They may have 2, 3, or 4. But if you have a caseload of 30 students and each student has 3 goals, that means you have to progress monitor over 90 different goals. And that can be a little overwhelming, especially near the tail end of the quarter, because at the end of each 9 weeks, you have to do what's called progress monitoring, and you have to send that out to parents. So imagine trying to get all of that done within just a couple of weeks. It can be a little overwhelming. Update IEPs throughout the school year to reflect students' progress on goals. Sometimes we may have to update the IEP, and whenever we do that, we have to inform the parent. Now, sometimes special ed teachers, they can get by with talking to the parent and the parent allowing them to update the IEP without a meeting. But generally, whenever the IEP is updated, we have to hold a meeting. That means we have to schedule with the parent and the administrators, find a time outside of our regular class schedule to meet with them and to discuss any updates to the IEP. So again, that cuts into our day. Discuss students' progress with parents, other teachers, counselors, and administrators. Again, you have to have an open line of communication with all parties because you don't want information to fall through the cracks. Supervise and mentor teacher assistants to work with students with disabilities. If you have instructional assistants in the school and they work with you, then you have to make sure that they're properly trained so that they can assist. Because special ed teachers, as great as we are, we can't be everywhere. So that's where instructional aides come in. And if they have the necessary knowledge and skills that we need them to have, then it makes our job a lot easier. So it's very important that you communicate with these individuals so that they know what they're supposed to do in the classroom. And then prepare and help students transition from grade to grade and from school to life outside of high school. So again, this is helping those individuals that may need additional social emotional support. We're helping them because again, we want them to be productive adults. I always said in special education, I'm not just preparing them for the next grade. I'm preparing them for life because when they get out into the real world, nobody's going to be there to hold their hand. So trying to teach those skills in addition to everything else can be a little overwhelming. So as you can see, being a special ed teacher has a lot of responsibilities that go with it. Oh, but I left out the best part, student behaviors. Students' problem behaviors can be linked to intellectual disabilities, which results in stress for special educators. Students with intellectual disabilities in special needs schools often exhibit high levels of problem behaviors. And it's not because these are bad kids, it's because their brain is wired wrong. So they may need additional social emotional support. They may need time. They may need just somebody to sit with them and talk to them and let them vent about what's going on in their day. And sometimes that means that you have to step away from helping other students to do this, but that's part of the job. So, with all of those responsibilities, with all of the stressors that come along with being a special education teacher, you're probably wondering, why the hell would you want to be a special ed teacher? Well, there are a lot of benefits to being a special ed teacher. Some of the benefits of being a special education teacher include highly satisfying work, knowing at the end of the day that you've accomplished something, seeing the look on their face, that's worth more than any paycheck to me. Often higher salaries and benefit packages. Special education teachers, there's a high turnover rate. So to entice individuals to go into special education, a lot of schools will offer higher salaries for individuals willing to work in that field. Greater chance of employability. The one thing that I was told that when I graduated from college was that if you want a job, go into special education because you will never be without a job. The one thing that they failed to mention, though, is that once you have a special ed license, that's usually all the schools will see. It doesn't matter if you have a background in math or language arts or even science. If you have a special ed license, they're going to snatch you up quick. So if you want to teach and you have a special ed license, be prepared to teach special education. Mastering patience and adaptability. Again, this is something that can not only help you in your work life, but your everyday life as well, because being able to be patient and think quick on your feet will help you in your regular life and with your family. Developing a genuine understanding of students' individual characteristics. Getting to know your students is one of the best parts of the job, because as a general ed teacher, you may work with 200 some students, and sometimes it's hard to remember all of their names. But as a special ed teacher, you really get to know your students and you can develop really strong bonds with them. And then serving a large community. Again, special education is a growing field, and every year more and more people go into special education, either as teachers or as individuals with learning disabilities. So being able to serve in that large community is very rewarding. So now that we've talked about the pros and the cons of being a special ed teacher, hopefully it gives you a little better insight as to what are some of the difficulties with being a special education teacher. And believe me when I say special education is not for everybody. It's not, because I didn't think that it was something that I would be interested in, but I fell in love with it. But I've seen other individuals that really love working with learning disabled kids, but when they get into the actual field of special education, they get burnt out easily. And again, if you don't have the patience, if you don't have that unwillingness not to give up on your students, or if you don't have the time to focus on individual students as well as large groups of students, if you're passionate about special education, then go into it. But just be aware that there are going to be challenges that come up, and you have to be able to think quick on your feet, and you have to be resilient, because that's the biggest part of being a special ed teacher, is knowing that you can't solve all problems, but the problems that you can solve, you can make an impact in those lives. So, what are we going to be learning about next week? Next week's lesson, dun dun dun. That's right. It is a surprise. So if you want to find out what we're going to be talking about next week, you're just going to have to tune in. However, if you liked what you saw, please click the like button. And if you want updates on future videos, feel free to click the subscribe button and ring the bell for updates on future videos. And as always, if there was something that really appealed to you or you have questions following up this video, please drop a line in the comments section. I would love to hear from you. And until next time, class dismissed.